must have is an advanced naval defense industrial base. Finally, the high life cycle costs attached to this sort of high technology are compounded by the need to ensure safety in absolute terms and credibility relative to the adversary. Having an SSBN for strategic deterrence, in my view, comes with 4 additional responsibilities for the country possessing them. 1, the search for strategic depth, which is inherent to SSBNs, gives them an unescapable global reach. This makes them particularly unsuited to national nuclear deterrence with a declared strict regional utility, if not a bilateral one, with an immediate neighbour. 2, except for the very beginning of the Cold War, strategic deterrence at sea has ensured that technology and technologists drive ever less capability and force structuring. Rather, it is political leaders and policymakers who do. 3, focusing on strategic deterrence via a sea-based deterrent allows for hollowing out of land and air capabilities made redundant and or obsolete by the sea-based deterrents. And countries who say so and who are retiring those old systems, I think, get complimented for it. Of course, not having a sea-based deterrent does not prevent this retiring process from otherwise taking place, and for countries otherwise saying so. 4, having an SSBN requires, in my view, a very robust command and control. SSBNs entail also a duty to manage the mating of warheads and missiles. This brings me to my last 4th proposition. Nuclear weapons brought to sea really do not have any currency anymore for anything else than strategic deterrence. In the 1950s and early 1960s, the US and Soviet Union deployed nuclear tactical weapons, thinking they could use them to win World War III. This came with a heavy cloak of ambiguity, including a US policy of neither confirming or denying the presence of nuclear weapons on board ships. Until the 1990s, nuclear depth charges and nuclear torpedoes were intended for breaking the sort of naval blockades or maritime exclusion zones that would have prevented the US from helping Europe in the case of a Soviet invasion. This amounted to the use of tactical nuclear weapons in the specific counterforce context of anti-submarine warfare. The Tomahawk nuclear version, the TLAM-N, was introduced in the 1980s and presented another challenge in that respect. All of these systems, or the equivalents, have since been withdrawn from service in the US and in other Western navies. So today the rationale of using nuclear weapons in the maritime domain for warfighting is almost entirely discredited. As early as 1962, for example, US national intelligence estimates withdrew nuclear cruise missile submarines from the Strategic Attack Force because they would be used for anti-carrier operations, not strategic land attack missions. From the late 1980s, the US withdrew all of its nuclear armory from its floating platforms, except for submarine-launched ballistic missiles intended for strategic deterrence. This was based on a dynamic of limitation and reduction through bilateral arms control talks with the Soviet Union, but also a strong unilateral consideration of how cumbersome and risky non-strategic nuclear weapons were to manage at sea. Later, the risk of nuclear use with those weapons in relation to the nuclear taboo, which Desmond referred to, also became a consideration. And I would argue in this particular context that the horrific consequences of detonation at sea would be no smaller than on land, even if the sea is less populous by definition. The lifting of some ambiguity has occurred also. This was the chief logic for removing the nuclear Tomahawk, for example, of naval service. To give another example, France designated single-use platforms to dispel ambiguity and reduce accidents. So a subsonic conventional-only missile for conventional attack, and a supersonic nuclear-capable only for strategic purposes. As a consequence today, for all nations except Russia, maritime nuclear warfighting roles have been entrusted with conventional weapons exclusively. This has helped ensure that many states were able to reduce the political and military salience of nuclear weapons. In this context, the signaling value of detonating a first-use tactical nuclear weapon at sea in a crisis cannot be justified, in my view, on cost-benefit considerations, even, and actually perhaps especially, as a consideration of national interest. There is also the converse question of unintended, ambiguous signaling if a platform, designated as possibly carrying nuclear weapons as a waypoint to achieving an SSBN, for example, is detected coming out of port to go on patrol. Perceptions of non-intended adversaries, or destined adversaries to whom the weapons are explicitly designed to defend against, is another consideration. In the case of any release, quite obviously, there would be reactions from all nuclear weapon states and beyond. There are also considerations for extra-regional nuclear navies operating in this region as part of their global deterrence patrols, something Ambassador Naqvi spoke to last May when he wrote that the Indian Ocean could become the most nuclearized of the 7 seas. I conclude my 4-part presentation on these thoughts. If there are any naval officers or naval maritime experts in the room, I'd be delighted to hear from them in the discussion and to take otherwise questions. Thank you very much.
Ladies and gentlemen, you just heard Mr. Antoine Levick, who's IISS Research Associate for South Asia. He focuses on facts and assessment of South Asian politics and policies towards China, South Asian nuclear issues, and political and security perspective on Afghanistan and regional security, nuclear deterrence, as well as security in South Asia has been his research interest since 2009. And now for our final speaker, who has this task of mopping up this subject and without treading into the landmine of what has been said already, to talk to us about this. This is Brigadier Dr. Naeem Ahmed Salek, who's a senior fellow at the Sponsor Institute CISS, Islamabad. He's taught at National Defense University, Qaeda University, Islamabad. He's been a visiting scholar at CISS at Johns Hopkins, at the Brookings Institute, Stanford, and Stimson Center. Dr. Salek helped establish Pakistan Nuclear Command Control setup after the May 1998 tests and served also as Director, Arms Control Disarmament Affairs at the SPD. He holds a PhD from University of Western Australia, a Master's in History from Punjab University, a BSc Honours in War Studies, and an MSc in International Politics and Strategic Studies from UK. You have the floor, sir.
Thank you, Chair. So first of all, to reassure you, I have given up the PowerPoint presentation which I had prepared for myself. So I am just going to be very brief and try to cover the areas which probably needed more elaboration or were not covered in the earlier presentations. I will just very quickly run through the evolution of Pakistan's nuclear doctrine post 1998. The earliest articulation of Pakistan's thinking on the nuclear doctrinal issues came through an article by 3 former senior officials, Mr. Agha Shahi, Mr. Abdul Sattar, and Air Chief Marshal Zulfikar Ahmed Khan. And that article appeared in October 99. The timing is important because if you remember, 17th of August 1999, India had announced its draft nuclear doctrine. So this came a few weeks after that. So you can see that it also contained a kind of Pakistani response to India's doctrinal explanations. Their main argument was that Pakistan's nuclear policy was based on minimum deterrence. They did not use the word credible minimum deterrence at that time, and they also talked about a minimalist approach. But however, if you follow through that article, read it carefully, they themselves actually countered their own argument of minimalist approach by saying that minimum deterrence is a dynamic concept which is subject to change with the changing environment, and they specifically mentioned 2 things. One is the preemptive capabilities of the other side and the ballistic missile defenses if they deploy. So right from the beginning, neither India nor Pakistan was satisfied with the minimalist approach. They talked about minimum nuclear deterrence because at that time the purpose was to deter use nuclear weapons for deterrence, not for war fighting. And that is why they were talking about minimum nuclear deterrence. But adding the word, prefix credible meant that they wanted to have something more than minimum. And that is how it went on. Because India had also elaborated in its doctrine, draft nuclear doctrine, that deterrence is a dynamic concept, and Jaswant Singh is on record of having said that minimum deterrence is not a fixity, it's not a fixed number, it is subject to change with the changing environments. So therefore, this possibility of increase in the number of nuclear weapons in Indian and Pakistani arsenal was inherently inbuilt in the earlier articulation of the doctrinal thinking in the two countries. However, what we saw later on, that instead of accepting the reality of a nuclearized South Asia, India decided to challenge the credibility of Pakistan's deterrence, and starting from February 2000, they started propagating limited convention war under the nuclear deterrence. So they were basically trying to say that whatever conventional capability advantage they have, and which they had actually lost because of their own folly of testing in 1998, they wanted to restore that advantage they had, and that is why they were talking about the limited conventional war under the nuclear overhang. However, once it came to the crunch in 2001-2002 military crisis, they were unable to actualize that that limited conventional war. They had been talking about Islamic slicing and hot pursuit operations, but none of these could have happened without the possibility of escalation to higher nuclear levels. Therefore, they found refuge in the fact that because of geographical regions, India's mobilization time is far greater than Pakistan, and therefore they lose the element of surprise, and that's why they had to go for a doctrine which they called Cold Start Doctrine, and now they have renamed it as the Proactive Operations Doctrine. The purpose was not to give Pakistan any prior warning, and giving the capability of offensive action to the holding formations, immediately launch attack on Pakistan in case of any terrorist incident on Indian territory. And they had been testing that concept since 2004. However, once it came to Mumbai in 2008, I did not see at least a single statement emerging from India talking of actualizing the Cold Start Doctrine. They were talking about surgical airstrikes, which is not certainly part of the Cold Start Doctrine. So they have not been able to do that, but they continue to challenge the credibility of Pakistan deterrence at the doctrine level through the introduction of proactive doctrine, and practically by upping the ante along the line of control, and especially along the working boundary. So therefore, there is a constant threat of escalation, and they have in fact gone a step further by claiming the surgical strike. The point is that Pakistan denied that no such strike happened, but the disturbing fact is that the international community accepted it as such. There was no condemnation of India. The same international community, the same United States, which are talking about sanctity of the line of control in 1999, did not repeat that word once the Indians claimed that they have gone across the line of control for this surgical strike. And that is going to encourage India to go in that direction further, which is fraught with dangers. And for that matter, Pakistan then had to take certain measures. Initially, Pakistan had talked about, in that famous interview with Janek Ilwai to Italian scientists in 2002, he categorically said that we do not need tactical nuclear weapons for now. But then later on, because of the doctrinal challenge posed by the Cold Start Doctrine, and then also the fact which is ignored is that almost 1/3 to half of Pakistan's military is engaged in a prolonged struggle along the western border in counterinsurgency and counterterrorism operations, because of which there has been a thinning of forces on the eastern border, thereby creating a vulnerability which will be tempting for India to exploit in any future conflict. And that is what forced Pakistan along the path of developing and introducing battlefield nuclear weapons. Although the declaratory policy continues to be credible minimum deterrence, but a new term, full spectrum deterrence, was introduced. I think Pakistan needs to have a review of its declaratory and policy and the operational posture, and there is no harm if you think that credible minimum deterrence is no more valid as a doctrine for Pakistan, and we have to go for deterrence by denial strategy. Why not? Why be defensive about it? Why not declare it